Good morning, everyone. My name is Christina Leggett, a nuclear technology advisor for at Booz Allen, where I support DOE's Advanced Research Projects Agency Energy on the development of innovative, disruptive energy technologies, especially in the nuclear sector. And so it is my privilege to be the moderator for the first panel session of the day on the nuclear fuel cycle. But I have to make it clear that the opinions that I express here are exclusively my own, because in my opinion, behind every reactor is a nuclear fuel cycle. And so for those of you who are not familiar with the fuel cycle, or just as a real primer, the fuel cycle starts with mining uranium from the ground, at which point it is milled and converted into what we call a yellow cake, prior to being converted to uranium hexafluoride or enrichment into enriched uranium hexafluoride, at which point it is fabricated into fuel and then placed in a reactor for a few years to make power, cooled for a suitable amount of time, and then placed in a storage while the US waits or tries to figure out a permanent disposal solution. And so, as I mentioned, behind every fuel cycle or reactor is a fuel cycle. And the linchpin of the fuel cycle is uranium. And so one of our first panelists today, Amir Adnani, is going to talk about what the uranium mining industry is doing to address the increased interest in uranium supply to support new reactor development and in response to some of the geopolitical challenges that are going on around the world. We also have Patrick O'Brien from Holtec. So Holtec International focuses on, they're experts in the waste, so to speak. And so he's going to talk about Holtec's cradle to grave solution for dealing with the waste. And then we have two other panelists, Jacques and Carl, who are looking to change the fuel cycle by closing it, enabling recycling to enable better use of the nuclear waste. And so they're going to talk about the roles that their companies play in enabling the next generation of nuclear. And so, of course, we're going to talk about the elephant in the room. And as my colleague Carl pointed out, we're going to hopefully try to carefully escort that elephant out of the room. So before we get into the panel, I want to introduce our panelists. So our first panelist is Amir Adnani. Amir Adnani is the president and CEO of Uranium Energy Corp. Under his leadership, the company has developed into the largest diversified North American focused uranium company with low-cost, environmentally friendly in-situ recovery uranium projects in the US and for high-grade conventional mining projects in Canada. He's also the founder and chairman of Uranium Royalty Corp, which is the first and only publicly listed royalty company in the uranium sector. He was selected as one of Fortune magazine's 40 Under 40 Ones to Watch list of North American executives. He holds a BS from the University of British Columbia. Our second panelist is Jacques Mosseri from Curio. He's a mechanical engineer who received his bachelor's and master's degrees in mechanical engineering from the Cooper University right here in New York City. Previously, Jacques has worked on technical projects in biomedical devices and controlled environmental agriculture and has a background in 3D modeling and computational fluid dynamics. Our third panelist is Patrick O'Brien. Pat is the director of Government Affairs and Communications at Holtec International. For over 20 years, he has built a reputation for his proactive communication strategies, government and community relations, and media management in high visibility situations. Prior to joining Holtec, Pat spent 3 years with Holtec Decommissioning International as a senior manager of government affairs and communications. He's also served as a company spokesman and senior communications specialist for Entergy's Pilgrim Nuclear Power Plant and worked in state and local government in Massachusetts. He holds a bachelor's degree from the University of Massachusetts at Amherst and a master's degree from Norwegian University. And then lastly, and certainly not least, my colleague Carl Perez from Exodus. So Carl is a native New Yorker who graduated from Babson College. In his last year of undergraduate studies, he began his decades-long nuclear venture as a CEO of Elysium Industries, a molten salt reactor company where he led its partnerships, technology development, and government relations. He then co-founded Exodus Energy, a nuclear fuel recycling vendor, in October 2022. He advises several nuclear industries or nuclear initiatives within industry and government, and he recently became a published writer, having authored chapter 22 of the latest edition of the Molten Salt Reactor and Thorium Fuel Cycle Handbook. I suggest you get that book. So, that being said, let's kick it off with a few opening remarks from our panelists. Amir, uranium is an essential fuel for nuclear reactors. What are the market dynamics around uranium? And how has your US policy over recent years helped to restart the domestic fuel cycle?
Thank you for having me, and we'll just get right into it. So market dynamics for uranium really go back to what you touched on there, which is the entire, behind every reactor, there's a fuel cycle. Fuel cycle starts with uranium. So that's really the main demand for uranium globally. And as we speak, there are, according to the WNA, over 440 operable reactors worldwide. That means it's truly a global market. Over 30 countries are involved in this market one way or other. And so we look at uranium as a commodity. At Yellowcake U3O8, that basically trades at a number of conversion facilities in the world. Demand for uranium is on the rise because there's, again, the same stats show that we're bringing back reactors that had earlier retired, hence 3 Mile Island and what we saw there with Microsoft last week. Reactors that are under construction worldwide. It's very much kind of a China-driven growth story. But at the end of the day, it's a commodity that's in demand worldwide to basically act as the first step in the nuclear fuel cycle. It's a market that was very badly depressed for a long time. And so I've been in this business for 20 years. I started Uranium Energy Corp in 2005. When I started out, I had mentors that said to me, hey, Amir, like, you know, commodity business, you'll have 2 good years, 3 bad years. It's up and down. Well, in this 20 years, we've had 18 bad years and 2 good years cumulatively, right? And so it was a bit of false advertising for us to get into it. But that really means that there's been a huge amount of underinvestment on the uranium side of it. We basically used to have a uranium mining industry in the US in the 70s and 80s that led the world. There were, according to the DOE, there are stats that shows there were over 30,000 people employed in US-based uranium exploration and mining. Over 30,000. Today, that number is 400. Same stats. And we've gone from producing 40 million pounds domestically to right now, we're not producing any domestically. And so huge amount of underinvestment in uranium for one actually good reason. So we've all kind of paid the price, and I say we, like those of us in the industry, people that have lost jobs and kind of endured this long bear market. But we have to look back, I think, to what happened at the end of the Cold War. And when the US signed a treaty with Russia to dismantle Soviet-era warheads, to take that uranium, blend it down to LEU and sell that into the market, that exercise was actually, I think, from a personal point of view, so this isn't my industry point of view, I personally think that was good for humanity. And I think it was good from a strategic point of view to really reduce those warheads, those former Soviet-era warheads that were once pointing to us, became a source of uranium in the US. Because when we took uranium out of those warheads under the megatons to megawatts program, we had to find a market that can absorb that material. So we made room in the Western market in the US for that Russian material. And that exercise went on for decades. And that was a policy, that was a strategy by the US government. And we paid the price in that we gave up our domestic industry, but we got rid of over 23,000 warheads. Enter 2024, and the themes around the world are different. There's a lot of discussion around local supply chains, not just for fuel, but pharmaceuticals, vaccines. There's all types of things that we think more about local solutions. So in terms of policy, we now have new policies. And in 2024, the policies and things that we are looking at and realizing seem to be focused on repatriating the nuclear fuel cycle that seems to have been outsourced as a result of the end of the Cold War. And as we repatriate the nuclear fuel cycle, we have Nuclear Fuel Security Act, which is really aimed at trying to stand up a domestic industry around uranium mining, conversion, enrichment. And that goes hand in hand with the Advance Act to try to streamline the regulatory process to make sure the customers and new customers that want to build reactors here are doing well. And isn't it odd that in 1993, we did the HEU deal with Russia and made room for them. And in 2024, we have the ban on Russian uranium imports, another government policy that speaks to what we're talking about. And that obviously now introduces risk. It introduces risk of Russian retaliation. It introduces the risk of can the domestic industry ramp up fast enough to become a local answer to this growing demand that we have in the US. And so we have a number of successful legislative actions that have taken that you add them all up, I think clearly shows an intent by design to really see self-sufficiency in nuclear fuel cycle moving forward. And so, and just to wrap up the numbers for you, worldwide demand for uranium, since we started with uranium, worldwide demand is measured in pounds. So the world today is consuming, or is expected to consume, 200 million pounds of uranium for all those reactors that are operating. Almost 50 million, a quarter of all that demand, is actually US reactors. So what we try to talk about as a US company, a lot of times when we're on a global stage, is because on a global stage, no one talks about the US, because the growth in the nuclear industry is all China. And all the uranium comes from Kazakhstan and Russia. So when you're on a global stage, we try to remind people, hey, we hear that growth is in China, but the biggest fleet is in the US. The biggest demand is, in fact, even today in the US. So we think the idea to see massive new investment really come in on the nuclear fuel cycle, and including starting with uranium, is very much justified, needed. There's a good business case for it. And very much, I think we're at the very early innings of seeing this recovery and growth for many years to come in the uranium mining industry in the United States.
Thank you for that, Amir. And I should also point out, we have all this expanded growth, construction of nuclear reactors around the world, mostly in China. And that doesn't even include potential future advanced reactors, which will require high assay, low enriched uranium, which is just going to drive up the uranium needs even more. And so it's really important. And I should also add that the uranium, the HALEU that the advanced reactors are looking at demonstrating in the US was originally going to come from Russia, because they were the only ones who were making it. And so the US has been doing a good job of trying to stand up a domestic HALEU production facility, and the uranium mining part of that is actually very important. And even beyond the mining conversion, right? I mean, Honeywell, I think, is they were in hot standby. I believe they're starting up. I don't know if you can speak to that at all, but
well, yeah, I mean, I think just to quickly add to that, I mean, look, we're certainly doing our part. We started the first new uranium mine in the US last month. It started production in Wyoming in the Powder River Basin. So that's number one. Number two, when the Department of Energy created the Strategic Uranium Reserve, we supplied that reserve. We were the largest recipient of an award for that. So we were very proud to supply DOE. We were also very proud to sign an agreement with TerraPower after the HALEU deal with Russia collapsed for them, to be their uranium supplier for the SMR units that they want to build also in Wyoming. And so we definitely see a very strategic need for HALEU, as you pointed out, for the SMRs. But look, conversion in the nuclear fuel cycle, they always say conversion is like toilet paper. You don't like, you realize you need it when you're out of it. And you don't really think about it. It's like an afterthought, and conversion is like that. And we kind of have that toilet paper problem with conversion right now. And hopefully Metropolis will get up and running, and we'll see. But there may be, just like with enrichment, that we see investment being made in new companies. There may be the need for new company. And look, it's good to have disruptors. It's good to have new players come into a sector that badly needs a bit of innovation, needs some new blood, needs some new capital. So I also hope that the nuclear fuel cycle doesn't look like the same cast of characters that it's looked like for the last 20, 30 years. So hopefully that might happen on the conversion side as well.
Yes, and I also see an opportunity for that to happen on the back end as well, in terms of closing the fuel cycle by recycling. I think that, people who know me know that I'm the most passionate supporter, advocate for nuclear fuel recycling, closing the fuel cycle to enable environmentally responsible use of the waste. I don't know if you guys have noticed, I've been saying waste with quotation marks, but that's because I actually think that the 92,000 or so metric tons of used nuclear fuel that's sitting in casks around the country is actually not waste. I think it's a resource. And so with that being said, I want to turn it over to Jacques from Curio, which is actually trying to commercialize recycling technologies. I can say that in my role at ARPA-E, I'm a technical project manager for the Curio project on recycling. So I'm very excited about the work they're doing. And so I just wanted to ask you if you could talk about the role in your mind that recycling could play in enabling the further development of nuclear energy in the US. Also, importantly, what needs to happen to enable the successful closure of the fuel cycle in the US?
Absolutely. So my name is Jacques, born and raised in Brooklyn, and I joined Curio as one of the lead mechanical engineers. And our company believes that closing the fuel cycle by recycling will help bring up the entire industry, and it'll also help fill gaps that uranium mining can't reach because of the regulations, because we're expecting to see a demand increase of uranium in the future. We also believe that nuclear waste, or I should say nuclear spent fuel recycling, can decrease the amount of waste we have. We know that we have around like 92,000 metric tons in around 81 facilities across this country, each of which would have to be designed to store this nuclear waste for up to 1 million years before it can be safely disposed of. So we're working on recycling because that brings us a way to reduce the amount of waste we have and also reduce the amount of time that we would need to store that waste. Also, a byproduct, or I should say, one of the things we could get from nuclear spent fuel recycling is transuranic fuels, right? Because inside of this waste, we have plutonium and minor actinides that can make up some next generation fuels. And so in order for recycling to have that unleash its full potential, we would want it to increase the amount of uranium we have for enrichment. And also, we would also need to have other companies like startups we know are doing it to invest in the next generation reactors, the advanced reactors of tomorrow that are considering HALEU, and they should also consider true fuel, transuranic fuel, as some of the next generation power for these small modular reactors. Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, I wholeheartedly agree with that, what you said. And so I want to also provide some additional context. So some people may not know that the US actually has recycled used nuclear fuel in the past with West Valley right here in New York. They did it for about 6 years. It wasn't necessarily a success story, but we've actually done it. And I should also add that we're currently reprocessing used nuclear fuel from the experimental breeder reactor at Idaho National Lab to support some of these advanced reactor designs by recovering the high enriched uranium and downblending it to HALEU. And so we do have experience doing that in the US with multiple types of reprocessing or recycling technologies. The other thing I'd also point out is that, hey, you know what? Other countries have also done it too. Most notably, Le Hague in France. And then also our competitor in Russia. Remember, we're trying to enable a domestic sustainable fuel cycle. And so we've already got Amir working with the mining industry to enable a domestic supply of uranium. We've got Curio working on, and Exodus working on recycling. But there's also the need to bring back US leadership in recycling to the US, because that could also enable other paradigms like fuel take back, which is something that Russia is also providing. So thank you for those remarks, Amir.
Absolutely.
So Patrick, all right. So Holtec specialty is dealing with the waste. And recently, Holtec has gotten into the SMR business. Can you talk about Holtec's interest in a cradle-to-grave solution for nuclear and what that means?
Yeah, no problem. Happy to be here. And if you had told me 10 years ago I'd be sitting on this panel, I would have laughed at you. My background was in government, but I grew up in a community that had a nuclear power plant. And I did such a good job researching the industry before I jumped. So to Grace's point, did I get into the right industry? 4 months after I got accepted a job at Pilgrim up in Massachusetts, they announced they were going to shut down. And I spent the last 8 years after that basically shutting down nuclear plants to decommission them. Went over to Holtec about 5 years ago, and I'm happy to say, as a director of government affairs, I've never seen a time right now for nuclear with bipartisan support. Our company was really founded by Dr. Chris Singh, and really what we're known for is housing both wet and dry spent fuel. We're the worldwide leader in that. So, as I've gotten into the industry and my view in understanding nuclear has come along, really, I look at it as kind of our duty to ensure that the fuel right now is safe. And we can show that, A, we can build reactors, we can safely operate reactors, we can safely store the fuel, and then we can safely decommission them when they do come to their end of life. Hopefully not early like we've done at some plants. And I'm happy to say, Palisades is on target to return at the end of fourth quarter 2025. So we're working towards that. And then deploy new future nuclear like we're looking to do there with two SMRs as well. So really, our approach is safely store the fuel right now on site until DOE fulfills their commitment. We're also involved in the consolidated interim storage that DOE is looking to do at a national level through consent-based siting process. And we actually did last year get a license to operate an interim storage facility in New Mexico. The issue we face is not a technical one. We know how to store fuel. We know how to recycle fuel. It is a political issue. And I think that's our biggest challenge going forward is helping people understand the safety of the industry. I'm 43, so I always joke, my generation, right, wrong, or indifferent, understands what they do from nuclear from The Simpsons. And most of that's wrong. I spend a lot of time with reporters and government officials, starting at a very basic level, explaining to them spent fuel is not green in a barrel and oozing, regardless of what The Simpsons said. So I think as we continue to do panels like this, and as we continue to work in the industry, the more we can provide education and help people understand, the commitment to safety this industry has, and our commitment to not waste what is not waste. In my opinion, we're temporarily holding it until we can extract more energy out of that for future generations.
Thank you so much for that, Pat. I'm going to say I originally had a slide in the slide deck that showed a picture of Homer Simpson sitting on a barrel of green oozing waste, eating it. And I had a little caption that said, "This is not nuclear waste." So thank you so much for explaining that to people. So I also want to say that we do have a question and answer session for this panel session. And so I'm going to open it up for Q&A after Carl's question. So here's your chance to start thinking about those difficult questions that you want our panelists to answer. And I don't know, do we have mics that we bring around the room so that people can ask questions or? Oh, awesome, thank you. Okay, so Carl, I saved my favorite question for you. We talked about the elephant in the room. What about the waste?
So obviously that's a very loaded question. But first and foremost, thank you all for being here. Because, as Patrick was mentioning, 10 years ago, I was anti-nuclear. In fact, I came from a French family that protested against the construction of nuclear power plants. So I would have never thought that I'd be here 10 years ago. And in fact, if you would have told me 9 years ago that this room would be this full of different, folks from different industries, different backgrounds, that would be all the more impressive too. So, just taking a step back and talking about waste, frankly, I have every financial incentive to tell you that it is a problem. But frankly, it is not a technical problem. It's just an enormous untapped economic opportunity, frankly. And what's important to note is Exodus obviously was formed in 2022. We're a group of former Navy nuclear system developers, as well as former operators from La Hague, which you mentioned is the recycling facility in France. What's really important to understand is why now? Why recycling? Why now? Well, if you look at the prices of uranium, they have definitely skyrocketed from where they were 5, even 10 years ago. And so ultimately, that's making utilities start to look at, are there ways that we can actually source cheaper uranium? Another element is the fact that there's a big demand crunch. As Amir was highlighting, in the 80s, we were pumping out 18,000 metric tons of uranium from the ground in the United States from 250 different mines. We are barely able to match 5% of our demand currently, right? So the scale of the problem is enormous, which is why I think that mining and recycling have to coexist, at least for the next 30 to 40 years. But on top of that, there's a demand crunch because you have advanced reactors that need new fuel. And when we talk about uranium, not all uranium is equal. In fact, it takes roughly 6 to 7 tons of uranium, U308 that you take out from the ground, yellow cake, to be able to make that into enriched fuel, roughly 4.5%. And then ultimately, today's at least the advanced reactors that are trying to be commercialized need higher enrichments. And so, in fact, you need roughly 4.5 tons of low-enriched uranium to be able to make 1 ton of HALEU, this high-assay low-enriched uranium. So again, the scale of the problem is enormous in terms of the demand that we need to meet. On top of that, when you start looking at waste, the cost of waste storage is shifting. We were supposed to bury all the nuclear waste in Yucca Mountain in Nevada, right? Which was supposed to house 70,000 tons of spent nuclear fuel. Well, guess what? We already generated over 90,000, right? So even if we were to have a Yucca Mountain, there would not be enough room to put it all in. You need a second Yucca Mountain. In fact, we're going to have roughly 150,000 tons by the time we get to 2050. So if you remember what I was saying, we were producing 18 to 23,000 tons in the United States. There are 90,000 tons, of which 95% is basically untapped uranium. So today, the way that you store nuclear waste is you basically put it in a pool. It's basically just a collection of tubes with little rocks of uranium in it. And the issue is, since the Department of Energy was supposed to come pick that up in 1998 and hasn't, because no state is able to agree on where to host the waste, they have now been forced to basically put in dry storage in these canisters that Holtec obviously sells, but it's because there's no more room in the pool. And so what's happening is the Department of Energy said, our apologies, utilities, we collected a bunch of money from you, $47 billion to be exact, but we're just going to reimburse you for all the costs that you have to bear as a result of our breach of contract. So if you put anything in dry storage, our bad, we'll pay you back. But in 2016, they said, well, if you're going to go build out a reactor, you know that there is no waste repository. So you're now on the hook for a waste management cost. And so this standard contract was modified to basically say, well, us DOE, we will take title to your waste, either 20 years after the first discharge in your reactor, or 10 years after your latest license extension. So take Vogtle 3 and 4 that was just built after 2016. DOE might only take title to their waste 70 years from now, which means 70 years worth of costs expended in the waste management business. So you also need to think about the fact that we're talking about microreactors, small modular reactors, where fuel is going to be a bigger portion of the cost, and therefore the LCOE. So what we're really trying to do is make sure that we bring down the cost of uranium to a point where people will, or at least vendors, are not going to be financially penalized. And so, as Jacques was mentioning, 95% of that material is basically uranium that could be stored in an oil barrel, as opposed to big concrete casks. And then you have 2% of that, which we like to call uranium transuranic, which is a mixture of uranium with plutonium and minor actinides, which is neutronically equivalent to 20% enriched HALEU. So that could also be an opportunity for advanced reactors. So what we're trying to do is help the existing fleet with the uranium, but also the advanced nuclear fleet that is coming to fare. So one thing that's really important to note as well is that we're developing decentralized recycling systems. So basically a series of skids with a power processing flow sheet inside. It is not the process that is carried out at La Hague, even though a lot of our experience comes from there. And the reason for this is because we will be able to site that as CISF, just like a nuclear power plant or at a national lab. And that flexibility is really what we believe will help deliver on unit economics. So with that said, I'll let you guys go to questions.
Yeah, thank you. And also I want to point out, because you mentioned we might have about 150,000 metric tons of used nuclear fuel by 2050. Just by comparison, I mean, that's a drop in a bucket compared to the amount of waste that'll actually be generated from other energy sources. That is not as carefully tracked and managed as nuclear waste is. So with that, are there any questions?
My question is for Amir, because I'm interested to know what measures are taken in the minery that you work with in your corporation. Because regarding the minery of uranium, I'm from Argentina. In my country, minery of uranium is prohibited. It's banned because of the pollution that is generated when minery, even not only on open pit, but underground minery creates pollution on anything that is nearby the reservoirium. It carries on minerals, carries on rocks, and even worse when it carries on the liquid used to mine it or water sources. I would like to know what are the actions that you take for this minery, and how do you make sure that these are kept, how is fulfilled for an environmental, more safe scenario for uranium being mined here in the US?
Thanks for the question. One of the areas that really attracted me to the idea of mining uranium, and I actually don't like to use the term mining, and I'll tell you why in a second, is the fact that in uranium recovery, there's a process called in situ recovery. And in situ recovery plays an unusually large role in uranium mining compared to other commodities. So when you're used to seeing those big copper gold mines in Argentina, the only way to extract most commodities on the planet is through strip mining or conventional mining, which is an earth-moving exercise where you are digging and there's contained metal in the amount of rock you've removed, and you're separating the mineral from rock, and you have a much greater impact on the surface of Earth. Uranium has a unique a unique kind of ability to be dissolved in solution when found in sandstone settings. So it becomes soluble in the presence of an oxidized solution. And an oxidized solution could be a sodium bicarbonate, something that would be safe for you to drink. And that method of uranium recovery is today responsible for half of global production. And the majority of uranium that is being planned to be mined in the US is using that technology, including our projects. So we're focused on the idea that in situ recovery can actually be a disruptive technology if done right. And it can be not only low cost, but basically completely minimum environmental impact. So the idea here is that you've got a uranium deposit that might be, let's say, 300 feet deep from surface. We access it through drilling a water well. So a water well is like 10 inches in diameter, just a vertical well that's drilled, cased. You have a gaseous oxygen tank at top. You pump out the groundwater that's immediately above that uranium deposit that's high in radon and radium, and basically it's non-potable. So that water is pumped out, oxygen is added, and recirculated. Uranium in the presence of that oxidized solution dissolves. So now you recover the uranium without any surface disturbance, no waste rock, no tailings. So when we take stakeholders or particularly investors to visit the mine, it's the most anticlimactic, boring experience, because if you're a mining guy, you go and you want to see those big ore hauling trucks and big open pit, and it's a site, right? And we literally have people get out, and the most fascinating site visit we had was recently, where people got out and there's literally an antelope grazing, like right where you're sitting. Like I'm there, you're there, an antelope is grazing, and people are like, so where's the mine? And we're like, you're standing on the mine. And there's this small little wellheads that are sticking out that are doing the injection recovery. And so this is an area that I think has enormous potential. And my colleague, Catherine Arblaster, who's in the back, she's our VP of Sustainability. So she managed to take all of our activity that I'm talking about and publish it in our sustainability study, and then go and call MSCI and Sustainalytics, all these guys that look at this. And we said, look, here's our water usage, here's our carbon footprint, here's our plan to be net zero, because we don't have any, we don't use really anything that causes emissions. So we've got a plan to achieve net zero. We put this report out. Our sustainability score now is the highest in the uranium mining sector globally, and top 5 percentile in the whole mining world. And we're a young company. So I think there's enormous potential in the in-situ recovery technology. It can be perfected. It's a technology that was invented by the oil and gas industry in the US 40 years ago. It was perfected by the Russians and basically turned Kazakhstan into the largest uranium producer. They use exactly this same technology as well. But the birthplace of this technology is in the US. I think in your country, I've heard there's potential for this type of recovery. We have a small exploration team in Paraguay next door, and we're looking at the kind of potential for this in that country. And I just think it's an incredible way to be able to recover uranium, again, with low cost, but in an incredibly sustainable way. And our landowners like it. It's the same thing with landowners. We're on private property. And those landowners are also like, I don't want strip mining. I don't want a big open pit on my property. At our Burke Hollow project in South Texas, we literally have people do quail hunting while we install a well field. And there are wind turbines doing renewable on the exact same property. And there's a little bit of oil and gas around the corner as well. Incredible ability with this kind of mining to use a limited amount of footprint and coexist with all these other operations and activities. So, and we have a video about this on our website if you want to look at it, uraniumenergy.com.
I just want to say thank you so much for that question. It was actually one of the canned questions I was going to ask Amir. So I also just want to point out, when I first started my career, I started at the Nuclear Regulatory Commission, where I worked on more of the fuel cycle side of things. And the one thing I want to add, just to your point, is that for conventional mining in the US, at the end of life, the site has to be transferred over to DOE for management. Whereas for in situ mining, once the cleanup criteria have been met, it can actually be released for unrestricted use. Yeah. And so that's why I'm also a big fan of ISR. Also, there's some interesting chemistry in there, and I'm a dork.
Thank you so much. Gabriel Ivory, Texas A&M. Obviously, consent-based siting is very important for like every phase of the nuclear fuel cycle. So my question is, what is the best way to go about like getting the regional approval, and have you seen any trend, like any uptick in like the success rate, I guess, of getting that approval?
It's interesting. What we did in New Mexico, really, we were approached by a quasi-governmental agency that had been looking to site an interim storage facility. So they put out an RFP, we partnered with them. So in our minds, working through that process, we did a lot of education. We feel like that was, we had the consent of the local governments because of how the Eddie Lee Energy Alliance is structured. Subsequently, the state politics changed and there's been some challenges there. So we're, like I said, we're also involved in the DOE's consortium for CISF. And we're working right now with the state of Arkansas. And what we're trying to do, and I think this is a good model, though I think the runway might be a little bit long, no offense, DOE, with their projected 15 years basically to get to a license. But similar to kind of what Tara did in Wyoming, you've trying to find interested parties that want to be educated and then actually in some ways kind of bid for the business. Arkansas was attractive to us in our initial discussions because they had passed a bill last year that had looked to reprocess fuel and allow for that to occur. So they viewed it much more of a nuclear economic development project where you would house interim storage, you would reprocess fuel, and then you would either deploy in new nuclear or manufacture new nuclear and deploy around the country. So we're still in that education phase, and that's like really the first 2 years of the project. And then really what DOE is going to look for is some communities that are interested to be down selected to work through the process. So it's heavy on the front end education and really having those communities buy in, which is good at the end of the day. I mean, the communities we've looked at are very familiar with nuclear. And we think that's a huge piece of it too. For, having come from an operating nuclear plant side background myself, really the people that are most educated about nuclear are the ones that live closest to the reactor. So I think going forward, it's the right move. I would just hope it moves a little bit quicker than the projected timeframe.
And if I may add to that point, actually, it's the reason why we want to do decentralized recycling, because it allows us to show up at the nuclear power plant, and then when you want us out, we leave. We don't necessarily stay there forever. And the other thing is, again, the community nearby knows full well how safe a reactor is and how safely the waste is managed. But something that I may add is, what is consent? What is justice? What is, there's so many very philosophical terms that are used, in trying to contextualize how to get this done. But effectively, what you see with the consent-based siting program is that you have double-digit numbers of communities that are interested in potentially hosting spent nuclear fuel. But the one thing that has consistently come back is that they want to tie storage with recycling. That's because if you're just storing it, it's just construction jobs, right? You're not actually having recurring employment, feeding fuel production or any other economic benefit relative to the nuclear space. And one thing I was going to also add is consent is not just an American issue. It's an issue that you see really prevalent all across the globe, and not just in countries with very authoritarian regimes. I mean, it's really something that's quite daunting to have a hole in the ground for the next several tens of thousands of years where you put the spent nuclear fuel. And so Christina was alluding to fuel take back. Recycling, especially in a decentralized fashion, allows you to be able to sell nuclear reactors to countries and not necessarily have them have a repository. And that's a very important dynamic, because that's exactly what Russia is proposing to different countries that it's selling reactors to. They're saying, we'll sell you the reactor, no need for a repository, we'll take back your waste, and they recycle it. What we're trying to do is make sure that the local community and the utility that's in charge of that spent nuclear fuel fully leverages the value inside. They're spending billions buying that fuel in the first place, and there's billions of uranium value in it.
I think maybe just to add one thing too is, I said it before, it's not a technical issue. It's a political issue. And, our company works internationally, and we helped construct the interim storage facility in Ukraine, which has moved fuel. Even in the current state of what's going on in Ukraine right now, they have moved fuel to an interim storage facility. So it can be done, and it can be done under more extreme conditions than anything we would see here.
Yeah.
Oh, sure. Yeah, I'll just add something. I just wanted to now bring it back to, in America, we know that there's around 12 states, right, including New York, that were very set on solving the nuclear fuel crisis. And they even said in their law books that we won't accept any nuclear fuel, and we also won't invest in any advanced reactor technology to develop it until there is a solution for the nuclear waste problem. So basically what we're seeing is yesterday's nuclear waste is holding back tomorrow's nuclear reactor.
100%.
Oh my God, that was so nicely put. That is a wonderful way to close out this panel session. Please join me in thanking our fantastic panelists for a great panel session.